Hello, dear listeners. So, in the, as we would say in Dutch, kader of regular podcasting, which is, of course, what people like, we thought we'd try doing this again. The last one was quite successful. People appreciated having Dr. Wolfheze on. And this time we will doing an in-depth discussion about Dugin, because he's talked about quite a lot, Eurasianism, mass ball, these things get brought up a lot, but very frequently I think people don't quite know what it's actually about. So we'll be giving a bit of an idea about that and then doing a bit of a discussion about it. But first, because part of this is also about making it more of a Dutch show and giving Dutch topics more of a spotlight, we're going to go through a few things that have been in the news over the last few weeks to months that are interesting to a international audience, but also Dutch public could use a refresher on. And I'm going to start with reminding you, especially the Dutch people, do you remember that there was a terrorist attack on a church in Krimpen just 2 weeks ago? You probably don't. And the reason I bring it up is because this proves the power of the media and how yours image of the world is very much controlled by what the media puts in there. And that if you don't deliberately try to decouple yourself from the news cycle and strongly hold to your own views and build your own worldview, you will be flung like a playing ball from side to side by what the media wants you to think and what wants you to talk about. So I just wanted to remind you that terrorist attack from the left on a church, something that hasn't happened in about 2 decades, was in the news for 2-3 days and it's gone again. So, this is one of the reasons I don't like talking too much about the news, because I think it's sort of brainwashing you. So I'll start with that. Then the other big news was, do you want to add anything on the terrorist attack, Dr. Wolfheze?
Yes, once again, Faust, thank you very much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure. I will dive into the topic you just touched upon, the church attack in the Netherlands. I do think it's more than just news. It shows a tendency in Western countries, Western European countries, to desacralize the environment. This means churches are being closed voluntarily and churches are being vandalized or being attacked, as we have seen now in Britain. Don't forget that in France there was a campaign of church burnings with unknown perpetrators that proceeded for about 2 or 3 years the attack on the Notre Dame. The Notre Dame, as people know, in April 2019 burned out. Of course, some remnants are standing of it, but it was the most important site of French Catholicism. In Holland now, we are seeing for the first time, in many decades we see in Western Europe, which is the closure and the destruction of churches.
You're breaking up quite a bit there. Hello?
Yes. So can you hear me now? Yes. So what I was saying is that there is a larger phenomenon in the Western world of the desacralization of our culture. The attack on this church, it is symptomatic of a phenomenon that we have also seen in France with the church burnings, culminating in the burning down of the Notre Dame. Also churches are being shut down voluntarily, and also church services are not being attended anymore due to the corona measures. This is a very important tendency.
Yes, one of the things that was presented in the news as being extremely scandalous was that the pastor of this church said that God is more important than the corona measures. Now, this is a very normal position for any Christian to take, one would think. But this was presented as some sort of scandalous fringe opinion, whereas this would have been a standard opinion, say, even 50 years ago, and for any Christian it should be a standard opinion, that secular rules do not go above God.
Yes, this is exactly what I was pointing out. We are talking about the desacralization of the public sphere. Our public sphere is being emptied of holy symbols, of holy rituals. And this is, of course, can be interpreted as part of a globalist psyop operation on a large scale, which is now international, because church attendance is now heavily impeded by corona measures, COVID measures all around the Western world. It fits into a larger tendency of falling church attendance anyway. So I think this is just a culminating point in a large trajectory set in the 50s and 60s of desacralization. It's not a coincidence that this church attack is not being reported in the media. It's in fact symptomatic of the lack of sympathy in general for any kind of religious group and any kind of religious tradition in our country.
Yes, indeed. Right. One comment in the chat: the press is supposed to be a check on the government and not helping the government and the police. This is very true. The idea of a fourth estate and the control of government by the media, we haven't seen much of that. But, and this is a good segue to the next story, we did see that this week with a press report from the NRC about our, security service coordination, NCTV. And what it turns out is that our intelligence services are quite amateuristic. So there was, for a change, a bit of investigative journalism by the NRC. Of course, I think the main reason that this report was even published and why the NRC chose to follow up on it is because they can use the angle of Islamophobia and discrimination against women within the story, which makes it more palatable to the mainstream at the moment. But so it turns out that we have several intelligence services in the Netherlands. We've got the civilian IVD, the military MIVD, and the regular police, and they're all coordinated by a group called the NCTV. Their job is not supposed to be to gather intelligence, but just to get intelligence from the intelligence services and write reports with keynotes for the governments, for the relevant ministry, so they stay informed on whatever threat of terrorism or radicalization there is. And it turns out they've been doing investigations of their own, and they've been using dummy accounts to follow people, which is definitive proof that there is such a thing as Fed posters and Feds following and inciting groups. So, bit of a scandal. We haven't seen much of a follow-up yet. It's one in a row of scandals that have been plaguing the current cabinet, with the uitslagen, the toeslagen affair in January, the falling of the cabinet, trying to sideline parliamentarians. But like most scandals in the Netherlands, I don't think that much will come of it. Your comments?
Well, this National Security Council, it's a one-man institution which is supported by a staff, was instituted a few years ago without an explicit task, but with the implicit task of combating extremist violence in the Netherlands. That's why it's called terrorism. But as we can see, it has now expanded its field of operations to include surveillance of people that are not associated at all with any form of violence or any form of terrorist activity. It is the measure of ridiculousness is the fact that our own little publication called the Dugin, of which you are the spokesman, is also being observed and surveilled under surveillance of this institution.
Within the first alineas of this newspaper article, Dugin was mentioned. Dugin is, of course, a project that I started and we worked together on with a number of others, and of course it was called Far Right. I'm not sure that it's an accurate label, but yes. Whenever the far right in the Netherlands gets brought up, I'm usually also involved one way or another, whether I've done anything or not.
Yes, it seems to be the case that this institution called Coordinator of Anti-Terrorist Coordinator is more interested in surveilling native Dutch people concerned about the future of their nation than foreign infiltrators, network terrorists that have links to very dangerous organizations in the Middle East.
Well, I will say, in the interest of fairness, that they're amateuristic and incompetent on all levels. There were some accusations of Islamophobia as well, because they were very, very thorough about persecuting Salafists specifically. But one of the big things about it is they're doing investigation, which they're not supposed to do, but they're following individuals and they're saving data about individuals, something they're absolutely not supposed to do. And it's also, they're not following any of the laws regarding privacy. They're just storing them on personal drives. They're emailing them to like their personal computers. So there's no chain of custody with any of this information. So we have no idea what this service is exactly tracking and what they are saving about people, which is all highly illegal. Now, if we had a regular working parliament and we had an actual functional system, heads would roll for this. What they're doing is highly illegal, but I haven't even seen the PVV or Forum for Democracy or the SGP pose any parliamentary questions. So again, like I said, I doubt there will be really severe consequences. So long as what they do serves the interests of the system, no one will ever be severely punished.
Yes, the fact that it serves the system is also being illustrated by the fact that one of the conservative think tanks in our country, called the Blue Tiger, the Blauwe Tijger, it is a big publishing house that publishes things from a conservative point of view and also some dissident literature, but which is basically a conservative Christian group. This group is also being scrutinized by this specific watchdog, which means that their entire function is being skewed towards protecting the system that is now currently governing our country.
One functionary of the service was quoted as saying that their job is to prevent polarization within society, which is absolutely not a mandate the government has at all. It's not the job of the government to moderate public discussion. And what they had to say about Blauwe Tijger and what they have to say about a lot of peaceful anti-system organizations is that they are an anti-government conspiracy theorists, or that they're a threat to the democratic order because they spread anti-liberal ideas. So from having a mandate to try and counter terrorism, they're now trying to moderate public discussion and trying to make certain opinions taboo by giving them a label of being basically a terroristic threat just because they are anti-government.
Yes, I think this ties into a larger tendency of the current system to degenerate into a totalitarian practice. We have seen the same happening in Russia in the revolution in the 20th century, that the state apparatus is being misused and abused by a specific group that's coming to power. In our case, we could typify it as the woke liberal leftist.
Yeah. In that regard, we, of course, have been seeing a trend for a while that a lot of the censorship and systems of control have been outsourced to the private sector, because governments are bound by laws, they have parliaments that control them, but the private sector does not. The private sector has a much freer hand. So we also saw some people being banned on social media this week. Tom van Grieken, the leader of Vlaams Belang, was suspended from Twitter because he commented that a politician of the SPA had posters with Lenin and Stalin and glorified communism, and that was a problem, but apparently it was not a problem, that the Vlaams Belang would be attacked for any association with the right, but the SPA associating with communists was not a problem. And he was suspended for that. And he made a very right point, which we've made on Desacralization as well, that if corporations can censor the opinions of elected politicians, this essentially undermines the sovereignty of the nation state.
Yes, which ties in with the whole process of globalization, which is in fact aimed at destroying all kinds of forms of sovereignty, national sovereignty, people's sovereignty. It's a large phenomenon, this globalization, which is not based on any national, in no nation state. So it is not a surprise that exactly this kind of tendencies are now also being shown in our country, which is very small and has less ability to defend itself than greater nations.
Yeah, that's the thing. How can we restrict the power of Facebook or Twitter, just as the Dutch state? This would have to be done in an EU level, which again makes our power quite relevant, because EU seats are distributed based on population, meaning that, say, if Twitter decided to just blacklist the entirety of Monaco, what can Monaco do? Nothing, really.
Yes, on the other hand, there is a tendency in Holland, which is for our nation as too small to make a stand against globalism. I do not agree with that. I think it's very well possible for a nation like Holland, which is quite financially powerful place, and demographic. It is a question of the political will. The political will is lacking. It's being sabotaged from within by our, I would call it hostile elite.
Yeah, it's a cancer within. I agree that the Netherlands has a lot more slagkracht, as we would say in Dutch, than we are willing to use on the international stage. Again, we have the biggest port in Europe. We've got a huge amount of mega corporations. We've got economic power, definitely. We're also not that small of a country in terms of population. We could have a stronger military. There are options, but indeed the will is lacking to change anything. There was another account also suspended, and I think this would be more interesting for any international listeners. This Twitter account was called Vizier op Links, and it was essentially a group doing to the left what Antifa does to us. They investigated leftist activists at universities, politicians making very left-wing decisions or associating with communist or far-left groups, and they exposed them. And this was quite effective. It led to questions in Parliament. It's led to quite a lot of media scandal, and they were suspended yesterday, I think, just because, well, they were supposedly violating Twitter's policy of doxing, but really it's because they were being effective at this. They were effective at exposing politicians and journalists with far-left bias and university professors. Now, this is a tactic that, to an extent, will work if you've got enough of reach to impact people. I think a few people were fired because Vizier op Links exposed them. So this is an effective tactic, and I think this should be used more.
Well, what we can say about this development is that it shows that from our side, our movement is not able to do more than waging guerrilla war, digital guerrilla war against sitting powers. They have managed to set up this Vizier op Links. It was a relative.
And you're breaking up quite a lot there.
Organization. At the moment, our movement. Yes, what I was saying is that our movement is not able to stand on equal terms with our enemy in the open field. We are not in a position to compete with them on an equal level. I would consider this temporary success of Vizier op Links as nothing more than a guerrilla attack on the system.
Yes. Yes, it doesn't lead to any structural change. It's also not the first time we've seen activism like this in the Netherlands. There's an investigative journalist called Peter Siebelt who has done a lot of work exposing associations, for example, of the Green Left Party with communist groups like the CPN, the PAS, the RAF, the RARA, and all these sort of facts are on the table. It's known that, for example, Sam Pommes, who is an organizer for the Green Left Party, was involved with the train attacks in the 1970s, and he also opened fire on police officers on one incident. And he's still a member of the Green Left, and so are other people with a terroristic or violent past. So the facts are on the table, but it doesn't change anything. The same with even back in the 90s when the Imperium was a relevant organization. They had an investigative group called Odin, which also did the same thing, exposing leftists. And unfortunately, it hasn't slowed down their progress at all. You need to have people sympathetic to you in positions of power to actually turn this data into actual consequences, actual policies. So long as we don't have that, the information is nice. It might serve the red pill people to have proof that there is such a thing as a bias within the institutions, but it is not much more than that.
Yes, what you're saying ties also in with other piece of news that people have tended to overlook, namely the memorial of the 30th year memorial, if I'm correct, of the attack at Kedigem, which was a leftist terrorist attack on what we could call a nationalist party in Holland, some decennia back. This event has been completely overlooked by the mainstream media, but the irony is that one of the instigators of this, we would call terrorist attack, because somebody died and other people got wounded, is now in fact leading one of the main leftist media outlets called Anne Frank Stichting. It's a foundation that promotes multiculturalism in effect. And the leader of that group, an investigative group, and publishing house it also is in fact now the same man who was coordinating the attacks on in Kedigem against these nationalists. And he is a well-respected figure. He is being interviewed by mainstream press, although everybody knows his past. And this man is able to operate with complete impunity. We can say that this kind of Antifa activists are in fact earning their credentials in their youth by this kind of terrorist or vandalism.
The Anne Frank Institution publishes an overview of right-wing groups in the Netherlands every year. And this is used by the government as basically gospel to form policy on. The fact of the matter is the Anne Frank house was in the early 2000s involved with a huge scandal involving the fact that they had been associated with Antifa and the CPN in trying to censor newspapers. This is a book called The Tramconducteurs van Lijn 7, I believe. And this book showed that there was this commission set up that would try to censor newspapers for being racist or using insensitive language or female unfriendly language, but they had actually no mandate. The newspapers themselves subscribed to this, but they had no legal mandate to do this. And when newspapers like the Telegraaf and AD decided that they were going to look into why they were even getting all these fines, they found out they had no legal mandate, and that the people who were in charge of this commission were members of the CPN, and they shared a building with Antifa, and the Anne Frank Stichting was also heavily involved. So the Anne Frank Stichting is extremely left-wing biased. All right, then we have one last thing to talk about in Dutch news before we go into the main subject, and that is there was a report made by the Universiteit of Amsterdam, or rather it was financed by the Universiteit of Amsterdam, but it was made by Dr. Jan van Beek, and I can look at the other authors here, but this is a man behind an institute called Demo, Stichting Demo, and they do research into the costs of migration. So the Amsterdam School of Economics is the publisher, and it was written by Jan van der Beek, Hans Rodenburg, Joop Hartog, and Gert Kreffer. It's a study looking at the last 20 years of impact of multiculturalism on the Dutch economy. And essentially the conclusion is that multiculturalism costs us 37 billion euros every year, which is about 10% of the yearly government budget. And there were, so basically no economic positives they could find. And this is a well-researched study. It's 230 pages. I will throw a link to this study in the chat if people want to read it themselves. It might be relevant for any international people wanting to see a study about the cost of migration. There had been one other study about the cost of migration done in 2004, commissioned by the PVV. This also came to more or less the same conclusion, although the costs were lower at the time, that multiculturalism and mass migration are simply burdens on society, and they do not benefit us, as the standard leftist claims that they'll pay for our pensions or they'll fill those jobs that we need. This is probably not true. We've got two economic studies about this now. Them tried to claim that it was done without their knowledge. This was not true. The University of Amsterdam actually paid the researchers throughout the entire course of the research. It was done with the approval of the School of Economics, and they've got the facture, the bonnetjes to prove it. So it's a good study, and we now absolutely have the economic data that multiculturalism is just a burden. Whenever a leftist tries to tell you they come for our pensions, they do the jobs we don't want, it's just not true. Show them this study. And although, to be fair, I haven't even heard them make that argument for a while. It's all about diversity is good just because diversity is good. They don't even need an argument anymore.
I do think it's important from our side to say that this so-called economic thinking about migration, which is supposed to be beneficial economically, is a fetish. It is a way to appease the people. The government tells the people, look, we need these people for these and these economic reasons, these and these democratic reasons. But from our point of view, it would be true that even if the government narrative would be true, that economically it could benefit sections of our population,
Sure.
then still we would reject it. Economic growth is for us not a fetish like it is for liberals. From a nationalist point of view, the social well-being, the cultural continuity, and the collective life of the people is as important as economic prosperity. We should take that stance very firmly, because otherwise we fall into the trap of having to reason purely on financial and economic grounds with the elite.
We have a video about this on Dienst Bazuin called Het Australische Model, which makes this exact argument. Even if we were to use the Australian model and only allow in immigrants who would actually economically benefit us, this would still, on a long enough timeline, undermine our national character and culture. So to conclude this Dutch news segment, there are two videos I would recommend to Dutch listeners about these topics. On Dienst Bazuin, there is the video about the Australian migration model, and there is an overview of left-wing versus right-wing terror attacks and violence over the last 70 years since the Second World War, which proves that there is far more left-wing terrorism than right-wing terrorism, and this myth of the white man being very violent is just that, a myth. Okay, now, do you have anything to add in this section?
No, let's proceed.
All right. Then, firstly, you have a new book coming out, and this is relevant to the topic at hand. So what would you like to tell us about this book? Maybe tell us a little bit more about your background again, just for the listeners who are just tuning in and who didn't watch the latest episode.
Yes, so my background is in Semitic languages. Afterwards, I have made a doctorate that linked certain phenomena in my field of study, Semitic languages, to cultural anthropology. So that's an interdisciplinary promotion that I did. After that, I have written a number of books, and one of these has just come out at Cambridge Scholars. The actual title is The Former Earth, which is being illustrated by a painting from our Dutch national painter Jeroen Bosch, who everybody knows for his absurdical and hellish paintings, of course. Yeah. The Former Earth is the second installment in my series on the cultural historical background of the First World War, which I consider a watershed moment in Western civilization. And the content of this book ties in directly to the topic that we want to discuss today, namely Eurasianism. And it does so through the concept of geopolitics. So what I have done is make a flatline analysis of the world as it existed in 1914 from a geopolitical point of view. And I have used classical 19th century models of geopolitics to explain the motivations of the great powers of their time. What the Former Earth shows is that by the time the Great War broke out, a process had completed not only of imperialism, by which Europe had occupied most of the world, but also a process of the maturing of what I call the globalist, modernist thalassocracy. And I need to explain that word for people who don't know it. Thalassocracy, it is from Greek, it means sea power, simply sea power. And the sea power based on the Anglo-Saxon nations, Britain and America foremost, they had established a power grid, a power network that in classical geopolitical terms unfolded, surrounded the entire world island. When I speak about world island, that's of course the old world, so Eurasia and Africa combined. What we can say is that this model, geopolitical model, describing the world island as opposed to sea power, was very common in the 19th century. So the great German geopoliticians and political philosophers, Ratzel and Haushofer, they had basically been able to insert this theory, this model of thinking, into all decision-making levels in the continental powers. So their models were being used to understand geopolitical developments in Russia, in Austria, and in Germany. It is a very useful model because it gives an alternative viewpoint on events that happened since then, and also on our current situation as it is lying in front of us with globalization. So the opposition of telesocracy and land power, of sea power and land power, is very important to understand the movement that we call these days Eurasianism.
This is, of course, also part of Carl Schmitt's thesis about land and sea peoples.
That's right. So I can maybe add some words about the Eurasianist movement.
Before we know what Eurasianism is, I've many times said what your thesis that imperialism forestalled European conflict for about a century. This is why we didn't see so much conflict in the 19th century, because there was other lands to conquer. People often say that internal growth is the philosophy of the cancer cell, but in my opinion, the cancer cell is just manifesting one of the most basic drives of life, which is multiplying and expanding. This is what every civilization does. This is what people try to do. They want to have more progeny. They want to grow. Anything that doesn't grow dies. Therefore, the fact that we had South America, Africa, and Asia to colonize, to expand into, meant we didn't have to fight our neighbors. But then by 1900, indeed, the growth into these areas forestalled because there was no more land to conquer. So we started fighting each other again, culminating in the First World War.
Yes, what you're saying, I have described somewhat in my previous book, Sunset. It should be said that the Eurasianist movement per se, as it exists now, has its antecedents in the post-First World years. So the years that the Russian White movement was beaten by the Bolshevik government and went into exile. At that point in time, we can say started the Eurasian movement, which was based on the White Russians who were exiled, and who these groups they tried to explain what had happened to their country and to find a remedy for what had happened. This movement then was also important in political developments in Germany. In Germany, many people shared the same disappointment as the White Russians with the outcome of the First World War, because both nations, in fact, had lost that war. And many people, they looked for an alliance, a Russian-German alliance. And this was based on the Eurasian geopolitical thought. Now,
so maybe explain what that means, the Eurasian political thought.
Yes. It is very important to say that a materialist, determinist definition of Eurasianism will not suffice. So we can define it in a material way. We can say it is a geopolitical school of thought that analyzes power lines and power grids on the world in terms of geopolitical balance, in which it opposes the world island and the world island powers to the sea power nations. But that's not all. also Eurasianism has a what we would call esoteric element. That might surprise many people, but it is important for Eurasianists, of one of which is Mr. Dugin, who is a proponent of Eurasianism now, neo-Eurasianism now.
You have written for Mr. Dugin's magazine.
Well, there exists in Russia a group that is interested in Eurasianism. Some of the people that write for it are not Russian. Many of them are interested in Eurasianism from a larger than a Russian perspective. So if I'm writing for that, I'm always trying to contribute to Eurasianist thought from our Dutch perspective. What is our role in it? What is the future of our country in a system that would be multipolar as opposed to unipolar globalist? So,
yes, but I mean to bring this up just to show that you have quite extensive knowledge of also the viewpoints of Dugin and the Russian scene of this perspective. Now, it has to be said that Eurasianism is always presented as some sort of uniquely Russian thought. And this is often said by Americans, and I think it's because Americans are not familiar with any philosophy except Anglo-Saxon liberalism. There is, in fact, a very similar concept in German philosophy about Eurasianism, which was either Carl Schmitt or Alfred Rosenberg who formulated it. I'm not entirely sure anymore, but they use the term das Weltinsel, which is the world island. And they had this exact same view that whoever controls Europe and the Asian steppes has the power over the world because they have such geographic, demographic, and natural resource power. They are unbeatable. And you can see this idea back in the ideas of the National Socialists in expanding eastwards in the Generalplan Ost. This was formulated specifically that if Germany could expand all the way up to the Urals, they would be unbeatable by any sea powers.
Well, Eurasianist thought is much more than the Russian center. Of course, Russia is the center of Eurasianist thought. It is the historical origin of the movement, and also many of its most prominent founders have been Russian and continue to be Russian. But there are many others who have contributed to it. As you said, there is an organic connection between German geopolitical thought and Eurasianism.
Yeah.
But we should say that, for example, in our low countries, also there have been many people that have been writing material relevant to this movement. We know the man called Jean-François Thiriart. Thiriart was a Belgian. He is most infamous for having fought in the German army during the Second World War, but his motivation was not collaboration. His motivation was the fight for a larger European empire. And he was a Eurasianist.
You could say maybe he was a Eurasianist, but the idea, for a lot of volunteers in the German army, the motives were either anti-Bolshevism and anti-communism, or indeed the idea of fighting for the survival of Europe. It was not necessarily a support of Nazism.
That's right, but what we can see is an interesting development. Thiriart, in his later years, became very interested in what we would call a variant of national Bolshevism, which is a group that is a political project that is also informed by Eurasianism. And it shows the organic connection to the 1920s, to the White Russian movement, in which milieu, the Eurasianist movement was started, and its links to the German elite through the Freikorps. We know that the Freikorps members, there were many intellectuals between them, they had supported or had fought alongside White Russians, and they had seen the same atrocities in the East. And
for example, Ernst von Salomon, which his book Die Geächtete is about the Eiserne Division fighting in the Baltics against the Soviets.
Yes, so there is an organic link between the geopolitical thought of the Third Reich and Eurasianism. And there is also a link between Eurasianism and the empire idea that was promoted by Jockey, who wrote the famous book Imperium. And again, also he was
Yoki.
Yes. Yeah. So also he was in favor of strategic alliance, a geopolitical alliance between Germany and Russia.
He called this the Red-Brown Alliance.
That's right. So yes. That phenomenon still survives. There still exist in Russia groups that adhere to this kind of thinking. National Bolshevism, the party itself was forbidden, I believe, in 2010, but several groups survive. The most important thing to remember is that all these groups have been circling around the same kind of source material and same kind of political philosophical ideas that were foundational to Eurasianism. And it's very important to say to our Dutch audience that there is also a Dutch contributor to this movement. Most people, they don't know much about this, but there was a man, he translated, it was, I think, quite early on, a book called the Eurolinder book, right? It is, yes. So this man, he has had an interest in what we would call now Ariosophy, right? Ariosophy, it is the belief that the Aryan nations have a special task on this earth. And this Dutch man, he translated the Eurolinder book, which afterwards was proven to be a forgery, or in all likelihood is largely a forgery, to prove the validity of this Ariosophy from a very, what we would call Dutch Dietz nationalist perspective. So that is, Dietz is an old name for
the Greater
the Greater Netherlands, or what we would call in Latin Germania Inferior. So this man, his name is Herman Wirth. So you can spell that W-I-R-T-H. He wrote a book about several things related to Ariosophy. And the way that Mr. Dugin, most people don't know that, the way that Mr. Dugin got interested in Eurasianist thought is also through the work of this Herman Wirth. So, in fact, our modest small country has actually caused quite a stir, and has some historical responsibility for the movement called Neo-Eurasianism, which is now being led by Mr. Dugin.
Yeah.
It is a very interesting writer. His last book, the great book that he was writing for the last part of his life, called the Palestine Book, the Palästina Book, he wrote in German. It got lost. It's rumored to have been stolen by the Israeli Secret Service, whatever we might hold to be true or not. But some of the material that went into that book has been preserved, has been published also in bits and pieces. And this topic has been extensively studied by Mr. Dugin. So this is the point that I was making. The esoteric beliefs of Ariosophy, the esoteric beliefs that also underpin the Eurasianist school in a larger sense, which include a lot of traditionalist thought. These thoughts are very essential. They are very important to understand the mindset of the great lights of the Eurasianist movement and also of Mr. Dugin. It cannot be said that this is a materialist, deterministic school of thought.
I believe Guémon was also an inspiration for Dugin, especially perennialism in that sense. Now, it might be important, what's the difference between Duginism, Eurasianism, and Nazbol? Because Nazbol these days has become an incredible meme, unfortunately. Like you said, it was once a serious attempt to forge nationalism and Bolshevism together in Russia with a serious political party. But how would you define the distinction between these three groups?
Well, they are subsets of each other. So we can say that the Natsbol movement, the National Bolshevik movement, is a subset of Eurasianist thought, and Duginism is a subset of National Bolshevik thought. Although Mr. Dugin has, in his life, made many strange escapades, we should not forget he's an experimental philosopher who is interested in many unorthodox ideas. And he is not a man that can be easily caught in any specific category. I would say that Eurasianism, because it is the largest group of philosophical thoughts, would probably be the best way to typify him. Yeah. But such a thing as Duginism, it would not stand. It would not exist already for the fact that it's Mr. Dugin in his youth did say quite different things than he does say now.
Sure, don't most thinkers, but there is a subcategory of people who call themselves Duginists.
Yes, we should not forget something. Mr. Dugin is above all a Russian, so he might have a Eurasianist perspective and future to offer for the world, which he has contributed to by philosophical books, by readings, and by publishing all kinds of international magazines. But he remains a Russian, and this is very important for all Eurasianists. You cannot be a Eurasianist on a level that stands above the national self-interest of the nation in which you are born. That's an impossible thing. Also, he can't do that, and he never has pretended to. So if there is such a thing as Duginism, it would be a very narrow Russian nationalist version of Eurasianism, which proposes Russia as the protector and the greatest power of Eurasianism.
Yeah. So I would like to emphasize again for the listener that Eurasianism it's presented as being particular to Dugin and particular to the Russians, but that is simply not the case. Like I said before, there is the German conception of the Weltinsel, there is a German philosophical tradition within Eurasianism. You could argue to an extent, the French one, yes. And you could compare it to, say, how conservatism is different between countries. French conservatism is not the same as German conservatism, is not the same as Dutch conservatism. We use the same term for all of these things, but they are not quite the same. They have some shared general principles, but they come at it from a very different perspective each time. So you can have a Eurasian perspective as a Swede or an Italian or a Russian, yes. Still be opposed to Russia or Sweden or Italy.
Yes. Yes, you said it very correctly. National identity is first and foremost. Eurasianism, it is a philosophical perspective, and it can be a pragmatic political tool. So
European countries who equivalate it with imperialism.
There is a grain of truth in it. So Eurasianism posits the fact that Europe is unprotected. It's unprotected against the sea powers, against the Anglo-Saxon proto-globalist, that time proto-globalist empire. Eurasianism is unequivocal in rejecting Anglo-Saxon sea power. It sees in it the incarnation of evil. It's almost a religious belief that the Anglo-Saxon powers represent evil, degradation, secularism, and all things evil in this world.
I very much agree. I think the Anglo-Saxons,
I know that,
island nation, have lost their way about from the time of the Magna Carta. I think Germanics have an interest in liberty and freedom. I've always had that more than many other peoples. If you compare us to the Asiatics, we have much more individualist instincts and much more egalitarian ideas about how power should be distributed. But the Anglos, as an island nation, have taken this to an extreme. You see these sorts of things in evolution. For example, there's such a phenomenon called island dwarfism, where certain species who are stuck on an island for generations upon generations develop dwarfism as a means to save energy. So populations who are stuck on an island develop in different and interesting ways. And I think one of the things that happened is the Anglos developed into an extreme individualist sense of liberty because they had the freedom to, because they were not constantly threatened by war. As any Anglo-Saxon will always tell you that they haven't been invaded since 1066. Not entirely true, but let's say they haven't been conquered since 1066 entirely. Now, 1,000 years is quite a long time to develop intellectually and to even develop genetically. So my personal position is that they took a essentially genetic and ideological extreme route towards liberty, which has become self-destructive. And a lot of the problems in the modern world are due to the predominance of Anglo-Saxon ideas about liberty, freedom, and equality, which just aren't true.
Yes, well, what we can say for sure is that the continental European nations share a common enemy at this point in time, and that is Anglo-Saxon-led globalism. Protection from this is something that Eurasianism promotes. Mr. Dugin has proposed a model in which Russia would be, to use an old word, the katechon, which means the protector of the European nations, because it is the largest and because it has a nuclear strike capability.
Yeah.
But the way in which he implements it is not always, in which he practically wants to pursue this is very difficult, because he is facing the practical politics of daily life, daily Russian foreign policy, and these are not automatically good for his ideas, and vice versa.
It can't be said that Putins Russia is pursuing a Eurasianist policy.
That's right.
It is pursuing a Russian national interest policy above everything else.
Yes.
And of course, there's the challenge that at least Western European countries have become very degenerated and poisoned with all these Anglo-Saxon ideas, and Eastern Europe does not trust Russia. So it becomes quite hard for Russia to take that role. In an ideal world, I would say we need some sort of federated, strong Europe with some shared defense and maybe some shared economical policies, but still maintaining individual countries and individual identities. And this can be with or without Russia, but I think Europe, as it historically was, can easily become the dominant global power again if it were to assert itself. And as you said at the beginning of the stream, the problem is not just Dutch politicians having no will and being slaves to the American system. It is every Western European politician having no sense of will, except maybe Macron. But then Macron seems to be doing things mostly in his own interest.
Well, this problem ties into one of the main political priorities of Eurasianism, which is the foundation of empire, the building of Imperium in the Roman sense of the word. And we should never forget that the Western European tradition has two great empires, namely the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, from which we get, through various convolutions, the Holy Roman Empire and the Tsarist Russia. So there used to be two great power poles that derived their legitimacy from the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. People tend to forget that the Third Reich was exactly what it said it was. It was the third incarnation of the Western Empire. It pretended to be that, it wanted to be that, and it attempted to be that.
Just to give some context to this, and I'm not recommending Hitler because of Hitler. Hitler gave a speech once called Was ist Europa, in which he expresses this exact idea, that the Germanic tribes are the inheritors of the Western Roman Empire through the Holy Roman Empire. And that was very much how he saw this sort of thing.
Yes, so the defeat of Germany in 1945 made an end to the tradition of the Western Roman Imperium. It still exists in the East, right? Muscovy, now under Putin, has that potential to represent orthodoxy and to represent the traditions of the Byzantine Empire. Now, what we have seen in Western Europe is an inversion. What the globalist, American-led globalists in Western Europe have done is to invert the traditional empire style, that empire that used to exist here, through the EU project, which is a completely artificial project based upon no identity and no tradition.
Well, I would not say that it is entirely artificial. I think there has always been a sense of brotherhood among European nations, and like brothers, we like to fight each other sometimes. But I think we've always identified ourselves as being part of a greater whole with separate identities opposed to the rest of the world. We are not Africans, we are not Asians, we are not Americans, we are Europeans. So I think that sense of identity is there, but the way the EU was started and has developed has been anti-European, has become Anglo-Saxon and corporatist. And if anything European remains in it, it is French liberal thought, Rousseauian and Robespierrean thought, and that is also particularly un-European.
Well, the problem here is the cutting of the ties with history. So we have no legitimate continuity to the EU, which is an anti-hierarchical project, an anti-traditional and anti-Christian project. That is not true for Putins Russia. Putins Russia has organic ties with Russian past, stands for Russian identity, and has a very clear sense of focus on hierarchy. So it is in that sense potentially a good ground for the rebuilding of a Russian Imperium. That is entirely lacking in the West. Sorry.
What would you say to this argument quote in the chat saying Putin isn't really a Russian nationalist, he's more a Russian imperialist that includes former Tsarist Russian nations and peoples into a Russian federation?
Yes, I think this is a correct comment. Of course, imperium, an empire, means that there is a lead nation, like under the Roman Empire, there was a lead nation, the Latins, the people of Latium focused on the city of Rome. In Russia's case, the lead nation is the Russian Narod, as Dugin calls it, which is more than just ethnic biological stock. In the Western case, in the Western Roman area, it would have been the German nation, of course, which was also the carrier of the Holy Roman Empire. So they have 3 times tried to incarnate that. After the failure of the first Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire under Napoleon, there has also been an attempt to reinstate it through the German Bund. We know that parts of Holland and Belgium were part of that. Our provinces of Limburg and Luxembourg were part of that abortive attempt to continue the imperial idea in Central Europe. It's very interesting to say that Holland, the Kingdom of Holland, as it was founded after the Napoleonic Wars, was not allowed to enter that second project. Basically, Britain didn't allow that. They said
King William
cannot be.
King William, the Prince of Orange, who was the commander of the Dutch army at Waterloo as well, he actually wanted to enter the northern. He wanted to enter a sort of re-established Holy Roman Empire as the Burgundian Krijts, as the provinces of Holland had been in the high tides of the Holy Roman Empire before we separated under the Treaty of Westphalia. Because let us not forget, the Netherlands was part of the Holy Roman Empire until 1648.
Yes, so I mentioned this because this shows, most people don't realize that Dutch interests were thwarted by England. England refused the accession of the Dutch enlarged Dutch kingdom, which included in that time Belgium and Luxembourg, more than Belgium and Luxembourg, into the newly founded German Federation. So the reason for that was very simple. England didn't want to have competition. It didn't want to have a powerful state in the center of Europe with a strong fleet, which the Dutch would and could have built up and could have commanded Also because Holland was in that time still an important sea power. It had large colonial possessions and large commercial interests overseas. So here you see the meddling of what we would call in the European tradition the perfidious Albion in the against the interest of Holland in this case.
Perfidious Albion never gave us back South Africa after the Napoleonic Wars. They occupied it in 1806. We asked for it back in 1809. They kept it. Why? Because at the time there was no Suez Canal. It was extremely important entrepot for anyone to reach the East Asia. And this was a way for them to secure their interest in East Asia and keep basically any European powers out of the area except themselves. And which was also for them a foundation to then proceed to the colonization of British India, the Raj, for example. So yes, perfidious Albion has stabbed us in the back many times.
Yes, so the Eurasianist movement has been aware of the predicament of the continental European nations as a whole, as a group as a whole, not just the predicament of Russia. We share certain problems. We are all continental European nations are facing the effects of now globalist sea power. It's still sea power that controls our country through the NATO and through the globalist institutions.
It is not for nothing called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yes. So Mr. Dugin, what he does in his polemics, he always opposes Eurasianism to Atlanticism. So another word for the telesocracy, the Anglo-Saxon sea power, it is Atlanticism. And we find this is quite accurate. There are institutions in the Western world which are called, for example, Transatlantic Council, the Special Relationship. They are all Atlantic-based ideas and power structures that are not working in the interest of the continental European nations.
No. Indeed. Let me see if I had any points to add here. So we had the question if it was useful in our... So Eurasianism as a philosophy is of interest for any European continental power, really.
Yes. Also, I do think we can look at the practical teachings of geopolitics, 19th century geopolitics, which are still dominant in neo-Eurasianist thought. So geopolitics has been a science that has been completely sidelined from academia and from also from official government policy. But Eurasianism maintains this geopolitical school founded in the 19th century. And it is very useful because it gives us alternative explanations of world events. So one of the practical tenets for Europe of Eurasianist geopolitical thought through Eurasianism, it is that the position of Eastern Europe, certain sections of Eastern Europe, more particularly the region between the Baltics and the Black Sea, called the Intermarium, the in-between the seas area, are vital to the fate of Europe. So what happens there, in that area, decides the fate of Europe. This ties in to recent history, and it even ties into today's events, things that are happening now, for example.
Militarization of the Donbass frontier, for example.
Right. We should never forget that Russia is currently at almost all-time low in terms of territorial extent. The Western Russian borders are now at a point of the German occupation line of about 1942. So White Russia and Ukraine have been detached from the Russian Empire. And it is not for nothing that the globalists, now currently being led by the new White House, are stoking up unrest in this area because they know, they don't say that publicly, but they know something that Eurasianists know very well through geopolitical thought, political precepts, that this region, this specific area, is vitally important for the balance of power on the whole world island. World island means the whole area stretching from Zagreb in Portugal to Anadyr in Siberia.
Yeah. I'm not sure that they have such a philosophical concept of it. I think the American empire is a hegemon, and a hegemon always seeks to oppress any resistance to it. This is why it's in economic competition with China. This is why it's in military competition with Russia. These are its only real rivals on the world stage anymore, and Iran to an extent. And it will continue to try to destroy them as long as they oppose them. There was some rapprochement between Russia and America under the Bush administration. Under, I think, the sort of illusion that Bush was a conservative Christian and that they had joint interests in fighting against jihad. Because don't forget, Russia had just fought 2 wars in Chechnya against what, at least for the Islamic world, was a jihad against the Orthodox. And I think Orthodox thinkers would not be would say that the American attack on Iraq and Afghanistan was a form of a crusade. Certainly, the Muslim world has interpreted that in many ways. But that, of course, ended when Barack Obama came into power and started undermining any relations with Russia. And this has deepened and worsened over the years.
Well, from a Eurasianist point of view, the Chechen conflict is a highly artificial conflict. It has been created to a large extent by Secret Service activity from the West and money from the Gulf Arab states. So the conflicts that are happening around Russia are all of a very artificial nature. They are not natural. What happens is that the American hegemon, you correctly called it the hegemon, trying to rule the whole world, in fact, is using local frictions that always existed, exploiting them and making them much worse than they would have been in a situation that there was no foreign interventionism and mingling. It has been doing so ever since the Second World War, because America has been laying siege to Russia also in the communist times, and it's doing now so again. To go back to the intermarium concept, it is very important for us to correctly look at events in that area, because Holland has been affected directly by the conflict in the intermarium region.
200 civilians were killed.
That's right. The MH17 plane was shot down a number of years ago, which has caused Holland, and many Dutch citizens were on that plane, majority was Dutch passengers. So Holland has been, since that time, been taking a lead role in the attack on Russia, because Russia has been blamed, of course, for the shooting down of that passenger carrier. So it's very important that Holland looks at this in a very realistic way, that Dutch people try to understand the larger forces that are at work here. So the Dutch government has been letting itself used as a battering ram against Russia in the public debate. And this is continuing till today. Holland has also been in the forefront of the wish to impose sanctions on Russia.
And it's against our direct interests that, despite the fact that 200 civilians died, the sanctions we have put on Russia have cost our agricultural sector about 600 million euros a year. And we used to do great business in terms of manufacturing industry sales to Russia, and now we don't. And in effect, the sanctions have actually been beneficial to Russia to some extent, because they've been developing their own industry, particularly agriculture, since then, which is detrimental to our business because we are a trading nation.
Yes, so what you're saying is right. The globalist interests are not automatically Dutch interests, even although we are a trading nation, a mercantile nation. It does not mean that our interests are necessarily aligned with those of America and Britain. On the contrary, some of our largest losses in history are due to the influence of America. We did lose our Eastern colonial empire, the Dutch East Indies, not to Japan, but to America. America insisted on its independence. We have lost our brothers, the link with our brothers in South Africa, the Boer people, the Afrikaner people, through a decades-long campaign of globalist-led political correctness. So everything that's coming out from the Anglosphere has not been automatically beneficial to Dutch culture, Dutch economy, and Dutch politics.
No, exactly. Our country is split in two still, into Belgium and Netherlands, because of French and Anglo interference in 1831 and 1836.
You said very right. We should not forget that the treaty that finally founded Belgium, signed in 1839, was the Treaty of London.
Yes.
It was founded under the auspices of the British government. This British government, the husband of Queen Victoria at that time, Prince Albert, he put his relatives on the Belgian throne. We should not forget about these things. England has played a quite negative role in the split of Holland and Belgium. It's not to say that the Belgians didn't have some legitimate complaints against the centralized government of William I. But there really is a large degree of foreign interference that has negatively influenced our nation. As far as I'm concerned, I do agree with you. I don't define the Dutch nation as the nation that presently exists, indigenous people within the borders of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. No, our nation is much larger than that. We are the Low Countries. This means including Belgium and Luxembourg.
At least. You could even argue French Flanders and Artesia and Picardy, although those regions are very Francophile at this point, so I'm not sure those could ever be recovered. But yes, we have not done well by aligning with the liberal Anglosphere. And it is, I think, in our political interest to try and build an alliance with other European nations against America and perhaps with Russia. But again, I'm not sure that we need to have another powerful state lorded over us. I think a coalition and a balance of power within something comparable to the EU is preferable, because as we see on the world stage, we see in Europe, the only way to preserve culture and identity and sovereignty is to have a relatively equal balance of power. Because you have one hegemon, this will lead to the erasure of your own sovereignty and power. Within the EU, we see this with Germany basically deciding whatever happens within the EU. If Germany wants it to happen, it will happen. And Southern Europe and Eastern Europe have basically become colonies to the metropole, where they bring in slave labor and they consume goods manufactured in Germany.
I do agree that Holland should, preferably with Belgium and Luxembourg in a kind of a confederation, stands primarily for its own rights and make pragmatic alliances. This would serve Dutch interests. We should serve our own interests, not anybody else's. But I do like to warn people about the perception that currently dominates about Russia. Russia is being portrayed in the mainstream, of course, as an aggressive power, a dangerous power, and expansive power. I would argue the opposite. Russia finds itself in borders that are very constricted, that have taken off from the Russian nation large parts that used to be home territory for very many centuries. As I said, the Russian western borders now resemble the German front line of 1942. And another thing, Russia is under constant threat. It is being threatened by subversion from the inside, and its vital interests are being hurt by sanctions, by disinformation campaigns, and by opposition all around the world, everywhere where its interests are at stake. So I would say that Russia is rather on the defensive. It is also not a growing nation. It's a nation that has demographically imploded, that has a lot of damage left over from the Soviet times, which are still repairing. I would consider Russia rather a fellow sufferer. It suffers as much under the consequences of globalism in a more passive manner, perhaps, than we do. But it suffers as much as our nation.
Yeah, but if we were to form an alliance between all of the European nations, including Russia, Russia would have a very strong, dominant position. What we see, for example, right now with the gas line in the Baltic, what name is it?
Nord Stream, yes.
Nord Stream 2, yes. We see that we are dependent on Russia for energy needs, specifically gas. And couple that with them having a leading role within defense, having the largest military, we would rather be overshadowed by Russia. So it could be quite a threat to include them within any sort of federated European Weltinsel.
Yes, also we should not forget that Holland has is itself historically a sea power. So it is interesting to say that sea power analysis that Eurasianism has is being applied, is primarily important for understanding the modern sea power form that we are seeing now, which is a hegemonial power, which seeks to destroy all anti-forces and all alternative life worlds around the world. To impose a purely mercantile and a purely secular vision of the world. That's not what Holland has done. Our imperial experience is quite different. The 19th century was quite paternalistic. The Dutch colonial power took responsibility for its subjects. We should not wash it white and say everything they did was good and beneficial, but it tried that. Holland has also put more money into its colonies than it ever got out of it in terms of investment.
Well, certainly Suriname and the Caribbean. Within Indonesia, the economic analysis, this is my field of study, but the economic analysis about Indonesia differs. Some studies conclude that it was a profit, some conclude that it was a negative balance. On the whole, colonies cost European powers mostly in Africa, but were profitable within South America and sometimes in the Caribbean, depending. For example, the French colonies in the Caribbean did not bring in much profit, but the English ones did. So there's differing analysis on that one. Indonesia was, on the whole, maybe slightly positive, I would say. But at one point, they did bring in 25% of the Rijks revenue per year, just in terms of pure cash. But that's, of course, not counting how much we had to expend on the CNIL and on the administration and investments and so on. So,
yes, I think this was a project that collectivized the investment. This means the Dutch nation had to pay for these investments, and private profiteers, such as some oil companies, they got money out of it. But I think for the Dutch nation as such, the colonial project was not an exploitative concept. It was rather a natural expansion of Dutch ingenuity and Dutch mercantile enterprise.
Well, maybe from the point of the ethische politiek onward, when we decided that it was the role of the European, the white man's burden, to elevate the rest of the world to our level. A project that I guess to an extent we're still trying to do.
Yes, in a certain way, but we can see that America's actions in our East Indian colonies have also led to a lot of misery there. So our last colonial holding there was New Guinea, which was given by John Kennedy as a gift to Sukarno to keep him on his side against the communists. At the expense of the Dutch colony, which had been highly developed. Since that time, Dutch New Guinea has been exploited in the most ruthless fashion by American firms and has been subject to brutal dictatorship under Indonesian authorities, including the campaign of eradication.
No one else, they just do it indirectly through financial means.
That's right, it is a soft power approach.
Yes, and it works quite well. There's two more things to address before we finish here. Firstly, Dugin has expressed quite anti-white sentiments in a number of occasions. What do you think about that?
Well, I already earlier said that we should not forget that Mr. Dugin is above all a Russian, looking out for Russian interests. And I think if that's true, I don't follow exactly all the things he has been saying in this degree, but if it's true what he has said, that he is blaming whites in America, I would probably think, for certain things. We could understand this as realpolitik
Well, I can read you a quote here.
Yes.
I am a supporter of blacks. White civilization, their cultural values, false, dehumanizing, model of the world, built by them and did not pay off. Everything goes to the beginning of the anti-white pogroms on a planetary scale. Russia saved only by the fact that we are not pure white. Predatory multinational corporations, oppression and suppression of all others, MTV, gays and lesbians. This is the fruit of white civilization, from which it is necessary to get rid of. So I am for reds, yellows, greens, blacks, but not for whites. I will heartedly am on the side of the people of Zimbabwe. Now, I will say, if we interpret white to be specifically the American definition, white nationalist, whiteness, then I would agree with him. If we just say white people in general, then no.
Yes, I think this shows the flexibility of the mind of Mr. Dugin, who, on the one hand, is an ardent Russian nationalist, standing up for his nation, but on the other hand, attacking his enemies by supporting the enemies of his enemies. That's what I think he's doing in this quote. I think, to a certain extent, United States that would implode in a racial war would be in the advantage of Russia. Undeniably, it would be a strategic, correct move on their part to have to support any kind of movement that can implode the United States from inside. And perhaps the BLM movement is being viewed as such by certain people in Russia.
Certainly, if I were a Russian strategist, I'd encourage BLM as a way to divide the nations. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, we can see the same process at work in the First and Second World War. Germany, which was a quite traditionalist nation standing for law and order, promoted subversion in British India because it tried to engineer an uprising against British colonial rule. Yes.
Yes, that's true. I suppose it's a strategic move. I don't think Dugin is hostile towards white people for being white. I don't think he's hostile towards other European nations or Europeans in general. I think he has a problem with America and American power interests. And he expresses that in the sense of white because that is strategically useful, because white is a very demonized term these days. And I personally don't like the whole idea of white people anyway. I don't see myself as being of the same group of people as the Americans. And if anything, they're the remains of the criminals and the undesirables we deported to the colonies. So.
Well, I think what we can see is that, again, this white versus black narrative is being pushed artificially by globalist media into the European discourse as well. It comes from America, where there is such a conflict between the races. It exists. And it's being imported here, and it's very artificially exploited. But I do agree with you. Ethnicity is what counts. For Dutch people, not race.
Multiculturalism is an American idea, and it has been pushed over on us here. The whole American Weltanschauung is being pushed on us through media, through the internet, through... Back in the day, they used to have Radio Free Europe, which was just an American propaganda radio network. And these days, they've got Hollywood, they've got the internet, they've got so many things. Dutch youth speak some sort of papimento, sort of pidgin English mixed with Moroccan and a little bit of Dutch. I mean, America is just poisonous. So I understand opposition to it completely.
Yes, we are going to try, you and me, trying to make an appointment with Mr. Steukers, who is a spokesman for the Eurasianist movement, by the way, about Belgian publicists. And he has spoken about this, what you are saying, this nefarious American influence on European culture. In political terms, he has explained it by a deliberate policy of pyropolitics. So pyro means fire. The politics to destroy. So American politics in Europe have concentrated on the deconstruction, the literal deconstruction of European identity in order to weaken European resistance to globalist interests and to globalist projects.
Yeah, yeah. So you would say anti-Americanism is anti-white, or anti-white is anti-Americanism, something along those lines, at least within the context of Dugin. Then there's one last thing, which is the fact that Dugin has in fact spoken in the Netherlands, and he has met with Thierry Baudet. Do you think that's a very relevant thing? Does it have an influence on Dutch politics, or is just that an anecdotal thing?
What I do think there are two separate issues here. Mr. Dugin has been trying to promote Russian point of view, Russian alternative messages in Western countries. That's why he also had lecture tours. He is still publishing all kinds of articles in English. But there is also Mr. Dugin, the philosopher, who is not only politically interested. I think what Mr. Dugin is doing is trying to create a network of anybody that is not a pure globalist. So he has also seen Steve Bannon in Italy. He has visited many people in order to create a network of thinkers and supporters for an anti-globalist Europe. I think this is a larger project. If he has met Mr. Baudet, which I think he has. We could perhaps see it in that same view, but I would counsel any Eurasianist to be very wary of this development, because Mr. Baudet, when push comes to shove, is just a liberal, classical liberal. And liberalism is the essence of Atlanticism and the essence of globalism and the essence of sea power.
And he's not a very deep philosophical or ideological thinker. He shifts constantly on his positions. So he's not a reliable ally if you're looking for allies, in my opinion.
Well, I think Mr. Baudet might really genuinely be interested in studying Mr. Putin, because he's an exciting philosopher, an exciting writer. But this is rather like watching a movie at home, and your daily life might be something entirely different.
True. Okay. Well, what's the conclusion then? Well, firstly, I would like to point out Eurasianism is not just a Russian philosophy. If you know anything about the German philosophical tradition, again, some people like Carl Schmitt, there are aspects in it there too. So don't think that it's just a Russian thing. To summarize then on Dugin.
I think Mr. Dugin should be studied, because he is somebody that has reinvigorated ideas that have been long forgotten by many European intellectuals. So he should be read. Notice should be taken of his points of view, without necessarily copying them or taking all of them all too seriously. Thought experiments that might be interesting for Russians, and thoughts that might be interesting for Russians about esotericism and about orthodoxy might be of interest there, but not necessarily in other European countries. I think Eurasianism has a future, but it has a future that should be made in each nation itself and by itself for itself. And it should not look to a role model in Mr. Dugin, even if Mr. Dugin does many things that are useful, and he is supporting this movement in his way.
He is Russian, and that is fundamentally that is what he is, and that is where his interest lies. And since we are not Russian, we don't share the same interests, just the same as that we don't necessarily share the Americans or the EU's interests, and that these is not necessarily in our favor.
Yes, there is a beautiful old Polish saying, which is "Za nasza wolność i wasza." It means this. It means it is an old battle banner that the Poles carried during their wars against the countries that divided them. It means for your freedom and for ours. And I think under this motto, Eurasianism makes sense. We can fight pragmatically the same enemy in a common cause, in a common struggle. Globalism is our enemy. And if Eurasianism has some use, it is to carry that banner. That's what I would say.
Sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of idea.
Yes, we are facing a very powerful enemy. So we cannot do it as a Dutch nation alone, or that would be very, very hard. It would require an effort on the level of the 80 Years' War, which founded our nation. Even then, we made some pragmatic alliances with other countries, such as England.
Yeah, Germany tried twice, and Germany is a much more powerful nation and failed. So There you go. I still see a future in some form of a federated, strong Europe, not necessarily in handing over sovereignty, but in we need to have some common economic and defense policy. We need to shield our culture away from foreign influences. And I think we have the population, we have the economic power, we have the technological ability to become the preeminent world power if we were to wish to.
It's a question also of willpower and inner motivation. There is a saying by a Colombian philosopher called Davila, and he says there is no Roman spirit, no Roman legion without a Roman spirit. This means material power is not enough. Material power is secondary. It comes from an inner direction, an inner awareness of the needs of the day. And I think our own small Dutch nation has showed in history that it's possible even for a small nation to stand up to very large forces, if only there is a motivating thought that unites us.
Yes. Bloed and Boden is not enough. You also need Geist, let's say.
Yes.
And one of the things that has preserved us more than the Americans is that the Americans have no deep roots and no Geist.
Well, America, in a certain sense, is a more religious country than we are, but it is also a quite artificial country, which has been highly diluted in its founding stock. That is something that we are still in a slightly advantageous situation. We have more of a clear-cut ethnic identity, and we are standing on our own soil, in the middle of all the great heritage that we created throughout the centuries.
I would say America is more religious, but it is a very Disneyland-esque religion. Some groups are deeply religious, like the Amish, but the Amish then built back upon great foundations. I think Mormonism is very exemplary of how a lot of American religiosity is. It's shopkeeper, shop as you like, doctrine and dogma. Same with Baptists and evangelicals, which are the dominant groups in America. They're more spiritual than atheists, perhaps, but it's not really the deeply intertwined religious ideas, for example, that we as Calvinists had in the Netherlands or that the Catholics have in the South. There's just more tradition there. It's truly part of the life of people, or it used to be at least. And then these days, maybe not so much, but I don't see America as being particularly spiritual in any way.
Well, America is located in a region that for a long time in our history was unknown. It was lying beyond the world sea that we couldn't cross. It fell in the category of the Blessed Isles. So the islands which were mythological, where wild people were living in innocence and quietness. And I think Americans in their rather shallow way do preserve some of that innocence, perhaps, the founding stock. But it would be wise for them to investigate who is ruling them. I think many Americans that live their own lives very particular, very private, focused on their own interests and their own family lives, which is good. But they are not aware of what their government is doing around the world.
But their foundations are on individualism.
Yes.
They've never had a strong sense of community. They don't have community rituals. They don't have a sense of community. Now, this isn't always true. There is an American group called Identity Dixie, which are Confederates, Confederate irredentists. And I do think that some parts of the United States do have somewhat rooted traditions, the oldest ones. The states of Virginia and Carolinas, for example, which are the oldest parts of the United States, did at some point develop some traditions of their own, based especially on Anglo traditions and Anglo aristocracy. But those were destroyed in the 1860s. And then, of course, the Northern Yankee sort of identity in Maine and New York was destroyed in the 1890s with the coming of the Italians and the Irish. So I don't think there is much left there. For insofar as they ever had roots, they've been cut.
Well, there does exist an isolationist sentiment in the United States, which also became prominent again under Trump. You see this in waves. It was very strong before the Second World War, represented by Charles Lindbergh, for example. I think that potential is even philosophical in a certain sense, like Steve Bannon. He is a rather intelligent man. He has formulated a quite correct way, a new isolationist alternative for the United States. From our European point of view, an alliance with the United States would not necessarily be bad, provided that it's an alliance based on equality and multipolarity, as Mr. Dugin.
It has historically not worked. Who's the greatest friend of America in Europe? It is Britain. Has Britain really done that well by being, what's the term for it? Their greatest ally, I think, or... But yes. I don't think they've done very well by it. They've lost their empire to them. They've lost their preeminent position as a world economic leader. I don't think that Britain has done greatly by being the ally of the United States.
I think what you're saying is right. The Anglo-Saxon world is a totally alien life world for European, continental European in the traditional sense. If we consider ourselves that way, it is an alien place. But we should not forget that it's a place also riven with internal dissent. Some people have said that Anglos have been waging a war on themselves ever since their own civil war and the Reformation of Henry VIII that preceded it. It's the Cavaliers against the Roundheads, right? It is the extremist wokes who are in this case the heirs to Mr. Cromwell and his Roundheads. Yeah.
I believe Jonathan Bowden formulated a quote to that. He said something about the Puritans banning Shakespeare, Shakespeare being the ultimate formation of English high culture, and that this utter misunderstanding of what Englishmen were by the Puritans, that this streak within them is indeed what has led to modern woke ideology, I suppose you would call it, SJWs. But he would also say that Puritanists were people of extreme faith, extreme radicals, and that we don't have those enough on our side, not enough fanatics.
Well, it is for our nation important to say that the Pilgrim Fathers who founded this fanatic stock in the United States, they settled in Holland first, in Leiden, and they didn't feel good here. They left about 2 years later. Yes. So that means our nation has a different inclination. Although we are also radically Protestant, we do have another value system than the Americans. It is a quite particular value system, and I think solidarity, national solidarity, and volksempfinden, we can say, is much more strongly alive in a collective sense in the Netherlands than it ever will be in America. In that sense, Holland is very Germanic.
We have a Volkskultur.
Yes.
Which I think America lacks, at least certainly today. But then we've turned this too much into an anti-American stream. It was supposed to be a Duginism. I think, is there anything left to say about Eurasianism or Duginism that we haven't brought up yet?
Except to say perhaps that your point about the need for alternative power pole in our Western European context is something that we should all remember. At this point, the reinstatement of the old idea of Western Imperium, a Western power pole, is something that we need to pay attention to, because the EU has proven to be an inverted project that is working against our interest as Western European nations. And it would be good for us to investigate an alternative and a return to older forms.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll keep it at that then. Thank you all for listening. We will be doing another episode of this with Dr. Stoikers when we can get him on to talk about Greater Netherlands. Again, the idea is to do this more regularly, so all feedback on this is appreciated. If you want to see more of this, what sort of topics, you have guest suggestions. My aim is to eventually transition this more and more towards Dutch, but we might also keep it more broadly European and talk to intellectuals from other European countries. And then I'm specifically thinking of like the Nouvelle Droite or German national groups. So we will see, but all feedback is appreciated. I thank you again, Dr. Wolfheze, for coming on.
Thank you.
Check out his book. What was it called? The
Former Earth.
The Former Earth, about the First World War and the end of the old civilization of Europe, basically. And good night.